My son called me at 2:07 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I stared at the glowing red numbers on my nightstand clock for 3 full rings before I picked up. At my age, a call at that hour only means one thing: someone is dying or already gone. Dad, Dad, please. Daniel's voice cracked through the phone, shaking like the walls around him were about to collapse. You have to help us. I sat up in bed, my feet touching the cold floor. Eleanor's side of the mattress was empty, just as it had been for 2 years now. I still slept on my side, leaving space where she used to be, as if she might come back if I kept the habit long enough. What's wrong? I asked, already knowing the answer would hurt. It's Lauren, he said. She collapsed at home. We're at the hospital. They say it's her heart. Emergency surgery. They won't do anything unless we pay $25,000 up front. Dad, we don't have it. Please. Please. The number hung in the air between us like smoke. $25,000. I thought of the savings account Eleanor and I had built over decades. The money meant for emergencies for grandchildren we never had, for a future that had quietly shrunk after her death. I thought of the checks I had written for Daniel and Lauren over the years, the down payment on their house, the car Lauren wrecked, the credit card bills that somehow never seemed to go away no matter how much I paid. Slow down, I said, forcing calm into my voice. Which hospital? What did the doctor say exactly? There was a pause, a faint rustling sound, and then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, controlled, not weak, not desperate. I knew he'd say that. Lauren's voice, clear as day. She wasn't whispering to me. She was coaching Daniel, feeding him lines like a director behind the curtain. The phone connection wasn't strong enough to hide it, and in that instant something inside me shifted. I went very still. The darkness in my bedroom felt heavier, thicker. I could hear my breathing slow the way it used to before presenting a difficult proposal to skeptical investors. Assess the structure, identify the stress points. Don't react until you understand what you're dealing with. Dad, Daniel said again, "Are you there?" I closed my eyes. Eleanor's face appeared in my mind the way she looked 3 days before she died, pale, exhausted, but her eyes were sharp-focused the way they always were when she needed me to listen. If anything ever happens, she had whispered, her hand barely squeezing mine. Find Pat. She has what you need. At the time, I thought it was the medication talking. Eleanor was never confused, but grief makes you doubt even the strongest memories. They're getting ready to take her in. Daniel continued. We're running out of time. I thought of every dinner where Lauren rolled her eyes at my stories. Every time she called my home that old place. The way she looked at me during Eleanor's funeral, not with sadness, but with calculation. I had ignored it all because Daniel loved her and I wanted my son to be happy. But that whisper changed everything. Call her father, I said quietly. What Daniel's voice rose in panic. Dad, what are you talking about? She's dying. No, she's not. I ended the call. The screen went dark. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had heard in years. I sat there on the edge of the bed, my hands resting on my knees, staring at nothing. I had just hung up on my son. For the first time in 38 years, I had said no. I should have felt guilt. I should have felt fear. Instead, I felt something else entirely. Something that felt like the first full breath after nearly drowning. I didn't go back to sleep. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the darkness outside slowly turn gray. I thought about foundations, about load-bearing walls and invisible forces, about how structures don't fail all at once. They fail after years of small compromises. Just after 7, my phone rang again. I expected Daniel. The number was unfamiliar. Mr. Robert Harrison, a calm male voice said. This is Detective Michael Reynolds with the County Police Department. I'm sorry to call so early, sir, but we need to speak with you. My coffee went cold in my hands. Yes, I said. What's going on? There was a 911 call placed last night around 2 a.m. reporting a life-threatening cardiac emergency at your son's residence. Your insurance information was provided. However, when paramedics arrived, no one answered the door. No hospital in the area admitted anyone matching the description. I gripped the phone. We believe the call was fraudulent, Reynolds continued. And there's more. Between 2:30 and 4 a.m., someone attempted to access your insurance portal 3 times. The attempts failed, but the IP address traces back to your son's home. The room felt unsteady beneath my feet. You're saying someone tried to use a fake medical emergency to access my finances? I said. I'm saying that's what the evidence suggests, Reynolds replied. And in my experience, this kind of thing doesn't stop with one attempt. I thought of the documents Lauren had asked me to sign last Thanksgiving. Just routine updates, she'd said, smiling too brightly. I'd signed some, stopped at others. Reynolds lowered his voice. Have you been asked to sign any legal or financial documents recently that you didn't fully understand? Yes, I said. Then I recommend you freeze your accounts immediately and do not sign anything else until you speak with a lawyer. When the call ended, I stood at the window looking out at Eleanor's rose bushes, overgrown and wild. The whisper echoed in my mind. I knew he'd say that. Whatever this was, it had been planned. And I was the target. I stayed at the kitchen window long after the call ended, my phone still warm in my hand. Eleanor had loved this hour of the morning, the quiet moment when the house belonged only to us and the world outside hadn't fully decided what it wanted to be yet. Now, the silence felt different, heavy, expectant. I did exactly what Detective Reynolds told me to do. I called the bank, froze. My accounts changed every password I could think of. The woman on the line asked polite questions in a calm, practiced voice, but I could hear the concern underneath it. This wasn't routine. By the time I hung up, my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from clarity. Something had been moving under my feet for a long time, and I had mistaken the tremors for ordinary life. The first memory came back without warning. The day Eleanor died. I was standing beside her hospital bed, counting her breaths, bargaining silently with God or fate or whatever power might be listening. The room smelled like antiseptic and wilted flowers. That was when Lauren walked in. Not crying, not shaken. She came in with her arms folded, eyes sharp. Robert, she said, I know this is hard, but Daniel and I should probably talk about the house. Just planning ahead, to avoid complications later. Eleanor was still alive. Her hand was in mine. I remembered staring at Lauren, unable to speak, searching her face for something: sympathy, decency, a flicker of shame. I found none. I told myself later that grief had distorted the memory. I told myself I was being unfair. Now I knew better. The phone rang again, snapping me back to the present. This time it was Susan Miller, my neighbor of nearly 30 years, Eleanor's friend, the woman who brought casseroles every Sunday after the funeral because she understood that silence could be dangerous. Robert, she said, her voice low. I need to tell you something. I saw Lauren last night. I sat down slowly. What do you mean? It was just after midnight, Susan said. I couldn't sleep. I looked out my window and saw her outside Daniel's house. She wasn't sick. She was walking just fine. She had a thick folder with her, papers, legal looking. My stomach tightened. She met a man down the street. Susan continued. They talked for a long time. Then she handed him an envelope. When he got into his car, the light came on. I could see your name on the documents, Robert, clear as day. I thanked Susan and hung up the pieces, falling into place faster now, each one heavier than the last. This wasn't desperation. It was coordination. Detective Reynolds arrived at my house less than half an hour later. He didn't wear a uniform, just a plain jacket and a look that told me he already knew more than I wanted to hear. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place Eleanor and I had shared 40 years of morning coffee. We identified the man your neighbor described, Reynolds said. His name is Thomas Walker. He has a prior conviction for fraud in Ohio, 4 years served. He slid photos across the table. Copies of my bank statements, a photocopy of my property deed, a utility bill with my address. They were found in his vehicle this morning, Reynolds said. That suggests long-term planning. I closed my eyes briefly. Eleanor's whisper returned to me. Find Pat. She has what you need. There's more, Reynolds added. We discovered a preliminary power of attorney application, not filed yet. It names Lauren Mitchell as your representative. The words hit harder than I expected. Power of attorney, legal control, guardianship wasn't far behind. This isn't random, Reynolds said quietly. This is elder financial abuse, and you're the primary target. After he left, I sat alone at the table until the afternoon light shifted across the floor. Then there was a knock at the door. Pat Collins stood on my porch, her silver hair pulled back neatly, a small fireproof box tucked under her arm, like something fragile and dangerous. "Eleanor asked me to keep this," she said softly. "She told me to wait until you truly needed it." Inside the box were legal documents, an irrevocable trust, airtight and deliberate. Eleanor had protected everything before she died. Beneath the papers was a flash drive labeled in her handwriting, "For Robert, when the time comes." I didn't plug it in yet. I wasn't ready. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Don't trust anyone around her. T." An hour later, another message appeared. This one from Lauren. "You think you can stop me? This ends when I say it ends." I showed both messages to Detective Reynolds and to my lawyer, Sarah Bennett, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't waste words. She read everything, then leaned back in her chair. "She's overreached," Sarah said. "That's good for us. Dangerous, but good." That afternoon, Daniel came to my house. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His clothes hung loose on him. When he sat down at the kitchen table, he placed a small USB drive between us. "I thought she was cheating," he said quietly. "That's why I started recording." He swallowed hard. "I heard everything, Dad. Everything she planned, everything she's done." I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. I let him finally tell the truth without fear pressing down on him. "She said you were easy," he whispered. "She said once she had guardianship, everything would transfer automatically. The house, the money. She said you'd never even know what happened." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. He flinched, then held on like he'd been waiting for permission. "We'll stop her," I said. "Together." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the house settled into quiet again, I finally plugged in Eleanor's flash drive. Her face appeared on the screen, pale, determined, alive in the way only memory can be. "My love," she said, "if you're watching this, then Lauren has made her move." I listened as my wife explained everything she had seen, everything she had prepared for, every safeguard she had put in place, while I was too busy being kind to notice the danger. "Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used," Eleanor said gently. "Don't let her take your life, Robert." When the video ended, the room felt different, not lighter, stronger. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to run. I wasn't going to plead. I was going to let Lauren believe she was winning, and then I was going to end it. I slept very little that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind would not stop working. For 40 years, I had made a living by finding weaknesses in structures before they failed. Bridges don't collapse because of one bad bolt. They collapse because small compromises are ignored for too long. Lauren's plan was the same. It wasn't reckless. It was engineered. By morning, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The first step was protection. I drove to a hardware store and bought security cameras, the kind that record continuously and store footage remotely. I installed them myself. One faced the front door, one covered the driveway, one watched the back of the house. Texas law allowed it. From that moment on, nothing that happened on my property would exist only as someone's word. The second step was documentation. I organized everything: bank statements, fraud alerts, text messages, police reports, Eleanor's trust documents. I made 3 copies of the full file and stored them in different locations. If something happened to me, the truth would not disappear with me. That afternoon, Sarah Bennett called. "She's filed for emergency guardianship," she said. "Claims you're mentally incompetent." The words landed like a blow to the chest, even though I had expected them. "She submitted photos of your house," Sarah continued. "Dirty dishes, spoiled food. She claims neighbors have seen you wandering outside confused. There's even a letter from a doctor expressing concern about cognitive decline." "It's all fake," I said. "I know," Sarah replied, "but the hearing is in 2 weeks. Judges see an elderly widower living alone and a concerned daughter-in-law. We need to dismantle this completely." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table staring at Eleanor's roses outside the window. Guardianship. If Lauren won, she wouldn't need to steal anymore. She would own me legally. That evening, Daniel returned. He looked worse than the day before. When he spoke, his voice shook. "She knows I've been recording," he said. "She threatened me, said she'd frame me for everything if I ever betrayed her." I believed him. I could hear the terror beneath his words. "There's more," he said quietly. "She mentioned someone named Tom. She said if he ever found her, she'd do what she did before." Tom Walker, the fraud conviction, the anonymous warning. The missing piece clicked into place. The next day, I received a small, padded envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a prepaid phone and a single message. "Noon, 5th Street Diner. Come alone. I'm not your enemy." I stared at the phone for a long time. Logic told me this was dangerous. Instinct told me it was necessary. At the diner, I recognized Tom immediately. He looked older than his years, hollowed out by time and loss. He didn't smile. 7 years ago, he said, I met a woman named Rachel Moore. She took everything from me, my money, my future. Then she framed me and disappeared. "She's Lauren Mitchell now," I said. He nodded. "She's done this before. Multiple times. Different names. Same method." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were police reports, aliases, victim statements, court records from 3 states. "She targets people who trust Tom," said. "The lonely, the kind, the ones who don't expect cruelty from someone they love." By the time I left the diner, the shape of the truth was unmistakable. Lauren wasn't just dangerous, she was practiced. The counteroffensive began that night. Detective Reynolds coordinated with the prosecutor. Sarah prepared motions to challenge the guardianship. Daniel agreed to help despite the fear still etched into his face. Susan and Pat agreed to testify. Tom stayed close, waiting. The trap was simple. Greed would bring Lauren to me. I invited her to dinner, a reconciliation, a compromise. I let her believe I was tired, confused, ready to surrender. She accepted within the hour. Saturday came slowly. By evening, the house was wired with cameras and microphones. Detective Reynolds and his team waited nearby. Daniel arrived early, wearing a wire beneath his shirt. Lauren arrived precisely on time, elegant and confident. She brought a lawyer. She smiled like a victor. "Family matters most," she said, settling in. I played my role well. I spoke softly. I hesitated. I asked questions. I let her explain how signing the documents would protect me. Then I pressed a button in my pocket. Her own voice filled the room. The plans, the contempt, the admissions. Her face drained of color. She lunged for Daniel, screaming. The mask shattered. The front door opened. Tom stepped inside. Then another man, an older one, her father. She froze. Detective Reynolds entered, last handcuffs ready. "Rachel Moore," he said calmly, "you are under arrest." The screaming followed her out the door. The threats. The promises of destruction. When it was over, Daniel collapsed into a chair, shaking. I put my hand on his shoulder. "It's over," I said. But I knew better. For some endings, you don't feel relief right away. You feel gravity, the weight of what almost was, and the quiet certainty that this time the structure would hold. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant, the kind of place where time moved differently. I sat on a wooden bench, my hands folded neatly in my lap, listening to the murmur of voices echo through the hallway. Daniel sat beside me, rigid, his jaw clenched as if holding himself together by force alone. Across the room, Lauren, no Rachel, sat with her attorney, composed again, her face carefully neutral. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed she was the victim, but I knew better now. The hearing began without ceremony. The judge, a woman with tired eyes and a voice sharpened by years of difficult decisions, asked the first question that mattered. "Mr. Harrison, do you understand why this petition was filed?" "Yes," I said, meeting her gaze. "And I understand why it's false." Sarah Bennett rose smoothly, her presence calm and unhurried. She dismantled the petition piece by piece, the staged photographs, the forged medical letter, the so-called witness statements from people who did not exist. She introduced my independent psychological evaluation, 90 minutes of cognitive testing conducted by a licensed professional who concluded without hesitation that my mind was sharp and my judgment intact. The judge listened. She asked questions. She frowned. Then Sarah introduced the recordings. Rachel's own voice filled the courtroom, stripped of charm, stripped of pretense. the plan, the timeline, the certainty with which she spoke about taking control of my life, about declaring me incompetent, about transferring assets automatically. Rachel's attorney objected. The judge overruled. When Daniel took the stand, the room grew quiet. He didn't look at Rachel as he spoke. He looked at the judge, at the truth he had been holding inside for years. "She told me if I ever told anyone," he said, his voice shaking but steady, "she'd destroy me. That she already had documents with my signature, that no one would believe me." The judge leaned back in her chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on Rachel. The ruling came swiftly. The guardianship petition was denied, dismissed with prejudice. The judge referred the matter for criminal investigation, citing clear evidence of fraud, coercion, and malicious intent. Rachel's composure cracked for the first time. It was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tremor in her hands, but it was there. She glanced at me then, and for a brief moment I saw fear. That afternoon, Detective Reynolds called. "She's being charged," he said. "State and federal, identity theft, elder financial abuse, fraud across state lines." I thanked him and hung up the weight of weeks lifting from my chest. But relief was not the same as peace. The trial came months later. By then, the story had grown larger than me. Other victims came forward, men and women from different states, different years, all telling the same story under different names. Rachel Moore, Lauren Mitchell, someone else entirely. The pattern was unmistakable. Tom Walker testified with quiet intensity, describing how he had lost everything and then lost years of his life to a prison sentence he never deserved. Rachel's father took the stand, his voice steady as he spoke of betrayal no parent should have to survive. When it was my turn, I told the truth. About the phone call at 2:07 a.m., about the whisper, about the moment I finally stopped bending. The jury didn't deliberate long. Guilty, on every count. The sentence was severe. Prison time, restitution, permanent restraining orders. The judge's voice carried finality when she said it. This woman would not harm anyone again. Rachel didn't look at me as they led her away. She stared straight ahead, the masks finally gone, nothing left to perform for. In the days that followed, the house grew quiet again. But this time the quiet felt earned. Daniel came over on Sundays. At first we didn't talk much. We cooked simple meals. We sat on the porch. Slowly, carefully, we rebuilt something that had nearly been taken from both of us. Trust didn't return all at once. It arrived in small, ordinary moments. One evening after he left, I returned to the fireproof box Pat had given me. At the very bottom was an envelope I hadn't opened yet. Eleanor's handwriting was steady across the front. "Open this when it's truly over." I sat at the kitchen table and broke the seal. Her words were gentle, proud, clear. She wrote about love and boundaries, about kindness that needed strength to survive, about believing in our son even when fear made him falter. She told me to live fully, to plant the roses she'd always wanted along the back fence, to forgive myself for not seeing sooner. I folded the letter carefully and held it against my chest. The next morning I went outside and began clearing the garden. The soil was stubborn, tangled with years of neglect. I worked slowly, deliberately, the way Eleanor always had. When I finished, I planted the roses she loved, the yellow ones that smelled faintly of honey. That night, for the first time in years, I slept through until morning. Not because the world had become safe, but because I had learned how to stand inside it without surrendering myself. And that I understood now was the quietest victory of all. Autumn arrived gently that year, the way it always does in Texas, with mornings that felt almost cool, and evenings that lingered longer than they should. The yellow roses along the back fence bloomed stubbornly, as if Eleanor herself were reminding me that some things endure even after everything else collapses. The trial ended on a Tuesday. By Friday, the house felt different. Not empty, not full, just honest. For years, I had lived inside a kind of quiet tension, waiting for the next request, the next emergency, the next moment when being a father meant opening my wallet instead of my mouth. Now that tension was gone, and I had to learn what to do with the space it left behind. Daniel came over that evening. He stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment, hands in his pockets like a boy unsure whether he was welcome. I stepped aside and let him in without saying anything. Some conversations don't need words. We cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy, just chicken, vegetables, and a pot of rice. the kind of meal Eleanor used to make when she wanted the house to feel normal again. We talked about small things at first: work, the weather, the neighbor's dog that barked too much. It felt fragile, like a bridge under construction, each word another careful beam placed where trust used to be. After we ate, Daniel sat at the table staring at his hands. "I keep thinking I should have stopped her sooner," he said finally, "that if I had been stronger, none of this would have happened." I looked at my son and saw not weakness, but exhaustion. Years of it. "She didn't choose you because you were weak," I said. "She chose you because you were loyal, because you trusted. Those aren't flaws, Daniel. They're just dangerous qualities in the wrong hands." He nodded slowly, tears gathering, but not falling. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't hurt. Over the next weeks, life settled into a rhythm that felt unfamiliar but steady. Susan still stopped by on Thursdays with pie. Pat visited once a month, always bringing flowers for Eleanor's garden. Detective Reynolds called occasionally with updates, paperwork, sentencing confirmations, loose ends being tied up. Each call reminded me that what had happened was real, not a nightmare I'd wake up from and forget. One afternoon, I received a letter with a Florida return address. It was from Rachel's father, Edward Moore. His handwriting was careful, deliberate, as if each word had cost him something. He wrote that testifying against his own daughter had been the hardest thing he had ever done, but also the most necessary. That he didn't expect forgiveness from her or for her only accountability. He thanked me not for vengeance, but for persistence, for refusing to disappear quietly. I placed the letter in Eleanor's fireproof box and closed it gently. As winter approached, Daniel began rebuilding his life piece by piece. He moved into a small apartment closer to his job. He started therapy. Some nights he called just to talk not about the past, but about the future. The calls no longer came in the middle of the night. They came when the world was awake and honest. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the trees, Daniel asked, "Do you think Mom knew how bad it would get? I thought about Eleanor's video, about the trust, about the evidence she had gathered quietly while I was still making excuses. I think she knew enough," I said. "Enough to protect us, enough to give us time." He nodded, absorbing that. The roses bloomed again in spring, bright, unapologetic yellow against the fence. I tended them every morning, my hands in the soil, my thoughts steady. The work grounded me, reminded me that care isn't about control, it's about attention. Sometimes late at night, I still thought about the man I'd been before that phone call at 2:07 a.m. A man who believed that endurance was the same thing as love, that saying yes was safer than saying no. I didn't hate that version of myself. I understood him now. He had been doing the best he could with what he knew. But I was not him anymore. What I learned is this: injustice doesn't always announce itself with violence or shouting. Sometimes it arrives smiling, carrying paperwork, speaking softly about family and responsibility. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who insist they're acting in your best interest. Standing up doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means preparation. Sometimes it means patience. And sometimes it means trusting that truth, given time and structure, can bear more weight than lies ever could. On a quiet evening months later, I sat alone at the kitchen table, Eleanor's letter folded neatly beside me. The house was still, safe, mine. I realized then that revenge had never been the point. Survival was, dignity was, the refusal to be erased. And if there was any justice in what happened, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, complete, and earned. That was the moment I understood something Eleanor had always known. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Kindness with boundaries is wisdom. And wisdom, I have learned, is the best revenge of all. Time did what it always does when you finally stop fighting it. It moved forward, not quickly, not kindly, but honestly. Weeks turned into months, and the sharp edges of fear slowly dulled into something manageable. The house no longer felt like a place under siege. It felt like a home again. I received the final notice from the court in early summer. The restitution schedule had been approved. The restraining orders were permanent. The federal charges were moving forward, though I no longer followed every detail the way I once had. At some point, staying informed began to feel like reopening a wound that had already closed. I trusted the system now, not because it was perfect, but because this time it had worked. Daniel came over the next Sunday carrying a small cardboard box. "I brought some of my things," he said, "from storage. Thought I'd sort through them here if that's okay." I nodded and helped him set the box on the dining table. Inside were old notebooks, a few photographs, and a framed picture of him and Eleanor taken years ago at a county fair. She had her arm around his shoulders, laughing at something he had said. "I forgot how much she laughed," he said quietly. "She laughed more than people noticed," I replied, especially when she thought no one was watching. We spent the afternoon going through the box piece by piece. Not to dwell, but to remember. There was no urgency anymore, no sense that time was running out. We talked about things we had avoided for years, the early signs he'd ignored, the moments I'd dismissed. There was no blame in it, only understanding. That mattered more than either of us expected. As summer deepened, I found myself doing things I had postponed for far too long. I drove out to the hill country one morning alone, just to see the land Eleanor and I had talked about visiting someday. I took my time. I stopped when I wanted. I ate when I was hungry. The freedom felt unfamiliar at first, like a muscle I hadn't used in years. One evening, Susan stopped by with her usual pie and stayed longer than normal. We sat on the porch as fireflies appeared one by one in the yard. "You seem lighter," she said. "I am," I answered. Not because what happened stopped hurting, but because it stopped controlling me. She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. There were moments, of course, when the past tried to pull me back. A letter from the bank, a medical form asking for an emergency contact, a random phone call late at night that made my heart jump before I remembered there was no one left who could reach me like that anymore. Each time I reminded myself that caution was not fear. Boundaries were not bitterness. Daniel began to change too. The tension in his shoulders eased. His voice grew steadier. He laughed more easily. He started talking about plans again, not as an escape, but as something he believed he deserved. Watching him find his footing was its own kind of healing. One afternoon, he asked me something that surprised us both. "Do you think you could ever trust someone like that again?" he said. "Not her, just anyone." I considered the question carefully. "I think trust is like a bridge," I said finally. "You don't stop building them because one collapsed, but you learn to inspect the materials more closely. You learn where to place the supports." He smiled faintly. "That sounds like you. Your mother used to say the same thing," I replied. As the first anniversary of Eleanor's passing approached, I felt the familiar ache settle in my chest. Grief doesn't disappear. It changes shape. I spent that day quietly tending the garden, letting the memories come and go without resisting them. In the evening, Daniel joined me. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. Before he left, he stopped at the door. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me." "I never did," I answered. "I just didn't know how to help you until you were ready to help yourself." After he drove away, I stood in the doorway for a long moment listening to the night. The house behind me was warm, solid, familiar. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis. I wasn't bracing myself. I went inside, turned off the lights, and sat at the kitchen table one last time before bed. Eleanor's letter was still there, folded neatly where I kept it. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. Its message had already taken root. Life doesn't always give you justice when you want it. Sometimes it waits until you're strong enough to carry it. Sometimes it waits until you're willing to see the truth, even when it costs you comfort. What began as a desperate call in the middle of the night ended as something quieter but far more lasting. Not revenge, not victory in the way movies portray it. Clarity, the clarity to see people as they are. The clarity to protect what matters. The clarity to understand that standing up for yourself is not an act of cruelty, but an act of survival. That night, I slept deeply without dreams. And when I woke in the morning, the sun was already up, spilling through the kitchen window, lighting the table where everything had begun. For the first time in a long while, I felt ready for whatever came next. The summer passed quietly, the way I had learned to appreciate after everything that had happened. Quiet no longer felt like danger, it felt like stability. the kind you build deliberately, one decision at a time. One morning, I received a call from Sarah Bennett. Her voice was steady, professional, but there was a note of finality beneath it. "The federal case has concluded," she said. She accepted a plea agreement, 30 years, no early release. I closed my eyes and let the words settle. 30 years was longer than the remainder of my own life expectancy. For the first time, I understood what true safety felt like, not because someone had been punished, but because the threat was finally gone. "Thank you," I said. "For everything." "You did the hardest part," Sarah replied. "You didn't stay silent." After the call, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. Eleanor used to tease me about that, said I made coffee for comfort, not for drinking. She wasn't wrong. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by unannounced. He had started doing that lately, no longer asking permission, no longer hovering at the edge of the doorway like a guest in his childhood home. He walked straight in, set his keys down, and sighed as if he finally knew where he belonged. "I got the email," he said. "It's really over, isn't it?" "Yes," I answered. "It is." He nodded, absorbing the weight of it. Then he surprised me by smiling, not the strained, careful smile he'd worn for years, but something lighter. "I enrolled in a certification program," he said. "Something new. I want to rebuild without shortcuts this time." "That sounds like a good foundation," I replied. He laughed softly. "You always talk like that. Occupational hazard." We spent the afternoon repairing a loose step on the back porch. It was small work, nothing urgent, nothing dramatic. But as we worked side by side, I realized how long it had been since we'd done something together without tension or expectation hanging over us. There was no crisis to solve, no money to discuss, just a father and son fixing what needed fixing. That night after Daniel left, I walked the property, slowly checking the cameras out of habit more than necessity. I paused by the fence where the roses bloomed, their scent faint but steady in the warm air. Eleanor would have loved how they turned out. I could almost hear her telling me I'd planted them too close together, that they'd need room to breathe. She had always understood that about people too. In early fall, I received one final letter from the court confirming that all fraudulent debts had been formally discharged. My name was clear, my record intact. For the first time since Eleanor died, there was nothing left to fix. That realization was more unsettling than I expected. When you spend years reacting, protecting, surviving, stillness can feel foreign. I had to learn how to live without an enemy, how to make plans without bracing for interruption, how to trust my own judgment again. I started small. Morning walks. A book I'd abandoned years ago. Lunch with Susan on her porch. Listening to her complain about the price of groceries and the decline of good manners in grocery store parking lots. Ordinary things, healing things. One evening, while sorting through old paperwork, I found a notebook Eleanor had kept near the end. It wasn't evidence or legal notes. It was something else entirely. Pages filled with lists, not obligations but intentions, places she wanted to see, meals she wanted to cook, things she hoped I would do if she wasn't there. I read them slowly, realizing she had never doubted I would survive. She had only worried that I might stop living. The next weekend, I drove out of town again. Not far, just far enough to feel like I was choosing movement instead of waiting. I stayed overnight at a small lodge, ate dinner alone without feeling lonely, and slept with the window open, the sound of wind in the trees carrying me into rest. When I returned home, Daniel was already there watering the roses. "Thought I'd help," he said, shrugging. I watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're doing well," I said. "So are you," he replied, and we both knew it was true. The anniversary of the phone call came quietly. No alarms, no nightmares, just another night. I marked it by turning off my phone early and sitting on the porch watching the stars come out one by one. The man I had been a year earlier would have spent that night replaying every decision, every word, wondering if he had done the right thing. I didn't do that anymore. What I understood now was simple, but it had taken a lifetime to learn. Love does not require surrender, family does not excuse harm, and silence, when used wisely, can be more powerful than confrontation. The greatest injustice I had nearly suffered wasn't financial ruin or legal control. It was the quiet erosion of self-respect. That was what she had almost taken, and that was what I had reclaimed. Late that night I went inside, locked the door, not out of fear but out of habit, and turned off the lights. The house held its warmth, its history, its safety. I thought of Eleanor one last time before bed, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. She had seen the danger. She had prepared. And when I had been forced to stand alone, I had discovered that I was stronger than I believed. This story didn't end with applause or spectacle. It ended with peace, with clarity, with a man who finally understood that dignity is not something you're given by others. It's something you defend quietly, decisively, and without apology. And that is how my life changed, not in a moment of rage, but in a moment of resolve. Not by taking from someone else, but by refusing to be taken from again. In the end, that was enough. The days after that settled into a rhythm I never thought I would have again. Not excitement, not drama, just steadiness. The kind of steadiness you don't notice until you've lived without it for too long. I stopped checking the cameras every night. Eventually, I stopped checking them at all. Not because I had forgotten what danger looked like, but because I finally trusted my own awareness. Hypervigilance is useful in a crisis. It becomes a cage if you carry it forever. One afternoon, while sorting old mail, I came across a bank statement from years ago, one of the early ones. The amounts were small, a few hundred here, 1,000 there. I remembered thinking at the time that it was nothing, that families help each other, that money comes and goes. Looking at it now, with everything I knew, I saw the pattern clearly. This was how it had started. Not with theft, but with permission. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me careful. Daniel and I talked about it one evening while washing dishes together. The window was open, letting in the sound of cicadas and warm air. I keep replaying things he said, trying to figure out when I should have known. "You didn't fail because you didn't see it early," I replied. "You survived because you learned when to stop pretending it wasn't real." He considered that, then nodded. "I don't want to become suspicious of everyone," he said, "but I don't ever want to be blind again. That's the balance," I said. Awareness without bitterness. In late October, I finally did something Eleanor and I had talked about for years but never quite got around to. I drove to the mountains. Not as a tribute, not as an escape, just because I wanted to see them while I still could. The drive was long and quiet. I stopped when I felt tired. I ate when I was hungry. I spoke to strangers without giving them anything they hadn't earned. For the first time in decades, every decision was mine alone. Standing on the overlook that first morning, watching fog lift from the valley below, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not grief, not triumph, acceptance. The kind that doesn't erase the past but finally puts it in its proper place. When I came home, Daniel had left a note on the kitchen table. I watered the roses. "See you Sunday." Simple, normal, everything that once felt impossible. That Sunday we grilled in the backyard. Susan stopped by, briefly waved from the fence, and joked about how the roses were showing off. Pat called in the evening just to hear my voice. No emergencies, no requests, no manipulation disguised as concern. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room with the lights off, the television silent. I thought about how close I had come to losing everything, not just money or property, but autonomy, dignity, the right to decide what happened to my own life. What saved me wasn't strength in the way people usually imagine it. It wasn't confrontation or aggression or revenge. It was preparation, patience, the willingness to finally believe what I was seeing instead of what I wanted to believe. I understood then that many people never get that moment. They don't hear the whisper, or they hear it and ignore it because it's easier to doubt yourself than to accept betrayal. I had nearly done the same. If there is any lesson in what happened to me, it isn't about villains or heroes. It's about boundaries, about the quiet power of saying no without explanation, about recognizing that love does not require self-erasure. I'm not proud of the pain that brought me here, but I am proud of what I learned from it. The house is quiet now, not the heavy quiet of loss, but the gentle kind that holds space instead of closing in. Eleanor's roses bloom and fade with the seasons. Daniel laughs more easily. I sleep through the night. Sometimes just before turning off the light, I think back to that moment at 2:07 in the morning. The man I was then would have given anything to go back to sleep and believe the lie. The man I am now understands that waking up was the only way forward. I don't feel bitterness when I think of her anymore. I feel distance. And distance, I've learned, is a form of safety. My life didn't change because I fought harder than anyone else. It changed because I finally chose myself, quietly, completely, without apology. And that choice, more than any verdict, any sentence, any public justice, is what set me free. Winter came softly that year. No storms, no drama, just cooler mornings and longer shadows stretching across the yard. I welcomed it. Winter has a way of simplifying things, of stripping life down to what actually matters. One morning I woke before sunrise and sat at the kitchen table watching steam rise from my coffee. The same table, the same chair, but I was not the same man who had once sat there frozen with fear, replaying whispered lies in the dark. I thought about how easily everything could have gone another way. If I had sent the money, if I had ignored the warning in my gut, if I had chosen peace over truth one more time, I would not be sitting in my own home right now. I might not even be making my own decisions. My life would have quietly ended without anyone ever calling it a tragedy. That is the most dangerous kind of injustice, the kind that wears the mask of concern. Daniel called later that morning, not because he needed anything, but because he wanted to tell me he'd passed his certification exam. His voice carried something new: pride, confidence, ownership of his own life. I couldn't have done this a year ago, he said. I was too busy surviving. You're doing more than surviving now, I told him. You're building. After the call, I went outside and trimmed the roses. Eleanor had always said pruning wasn't about damage but direction. Cut back what drains the plant, and it grows stronger where it counts. I finally understood what she meant. People sometimes ask me if I regret how everything unfolded, if I wish I had handled it differently, if I still feel anger toward the woman who tried to erase me. The truth is simpler than that. I don't regret saying no. I don't regret choosing clarity over comfort. And I don't regret protecting myself even when it meant disappointing someone I loved. What I regret, if anything, is how long I believed that endurance was the same as virtue, that suffering quietly made me noble, that giving endlessly proved my worth. It doesn't. It only proves your availability to those willing to take. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in soft gold, I sat on the porch, wrapped in a light jacket, listening to the neighborhood settle into night. A car passed. A dog barked. Somewhere someone laughed. Ordinary sounds. Precious sounds. I realized then that my life hadn't been restored to what it was before. It had been rebuilt into something better. Not louder, not richer, not grander. Stronger. Stronger because it was honest. Stronger because it had boundaries. Stronger because it was mine. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever been made to feel guilty for protecting yourself, if someone has ever called your boundaries cruelty, if your kindness has been treated like a resource instead of a gift, then hear this clearly. You are not selfish for saying no. You are not heartless for stepping back, and you are not weak for choosing yourself. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to be used one more time. My story didn't end with shouting or revenge or destruction. It ended with quiet mornings, honest relationships, and nights of unbroken sleep. It ended with dignity intact. And that is how I know I won, not because she lost, but because I finally stood. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Where have you been bending when you should have been standing? Where have you been silent when your inner voice was warning you? You don't need permission to protect yourself. You don't need approval to set boundaries. And it is never too late to choose clarity over comfort. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Remember this. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Kindness with boundaries is wisdom, and wisdom is the quietest, most powerful revenge of all.